What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and Games Workshop just dropped a massive amount of information for 11th edition 40k in a Q&A on the 40k YouTube channel. Now, this Q&A was long, and within it, it had a ton of little hints about what we can expect to see from the new edition. So in this video, I'm going to break it down. We're going to categorize all of the things that they discussed, as well as talk about some of the things that weren't necessarily highlighted within the Q&A that they did touch on. So let's dive in. Now, I've broken down all the talking points and the pieces of information that they dropped for us into different categories, and the first one is going to be core rules changes. In no particular order, let's go through what they discussed. The first one is that swarms can now move through walls and vertical terrain features, something that's been missing in 10th edition 40k since they lost the ability to breach through ruined terrain features that they had in previous editions. This made swarms kind of limited utility since they tend to be kind of slow and difficult to maneuver, and then not being able to go through vertical terrain features and walls and things like that made it very difficult to maneuver them around. Now they're going to be much more useful. Battle Shock is undergoing some massive changes in this new edition that they discussed. It now affects units that are at or below half strength rather than units that are strictly below half strength. So if, for example, you're at 6 wounds out of 12 wounds, you will have to force for Battle Shock checks. Now, as we know, Battle Shock now is a persistent effect that can persist for multiple battle rounds. You will become Battle Shocked from an effect or being below half strength. However, if you are Battle Shocked at the start of your turn, you'll have to retest in order to un-Battle Shock in your next Battle Shock step. They did specify that this is a change to the timing of when units un-Battle Shock. In the current edition of the rules, when you go to the start of your command phase, units un-Battle Shock automatically, and then if they are remaining below, then you would retake a Battle Shock chest to see if you regain that effect. In 11th edition, however, Battle Shock remains persistent until that Battle Shock step. You will have to test if you are Battle Shocked, whether or not you are below half strength, to lose the Battle Shock effect rather than to see if you gain it, essentially. This means that when you get to the Battle Shock step, your unit is still Battle Shocked if they were Battle Shocked on the previous turn, which means stratagems like Insane Bravery cannot be used to affect that unit. So, for example, if your opponent uses an ability or stratagem to Battle Shock you at the end of their fight phase, you go to your own command phase, your unit remains Battle Shocked until you get to the end of your command phase, then you will have to take a Battle Shock check on that unit to try to get rid of the Battle Shock debuff. Because you're Battle Shocked at that time, you can't use stratagems to manipulate that target that unit. They also specified some of the changes to cover. Cover is now a ballistic skill modifier rather than a saving throw improvement, which means that innately torrent weapons, which automatically hit and don't use a ballistic skill characteristic, automatically ignore it. Given the fact that a lot of torrent weapons in 10th edition have been given ignore cover just to simulate the effect of firing napalm into a building, for example, there is this weird idiosyncrasy where you now have a weapon keyword that actually doesn't do anything. They specified that that's intentional. The ignore cover keyword is in fact not going to affect torrent weapons. They'll just retain it until they're errated or their codex releases and removes it from the torrent weapon. There isn't going to be a cutout for torrent weapons firing into cover that would affect them. Torrent weapons are just, by definition, not affected by cover. They also reiterated that stealth is not cumulative with the effect of cover. Stealth is essentially another -1 ballistic skill modifier, and it essentially gives you cover out in the open. So if you have stealth, having that and cover isn't very useful. However, it is useful if, for example, you're a vehicle, since vehicles have a tougher time getting cover than infantry. Vehicles do not get cover from being inside terrain features like infantry will, but will be able to get it if they are partially obscured. The implication is that cover for them, despite the fact that you now can no longer get it for being wholly within a terrain feature, works very much like it does in 10th edition, where if you are behind the template and not within it, so it blocks line of sight to you, or you're behind a 3-dimensional vertical element of the terrain feature that is physically body blocking part of your model, you will get that -1 ballistic skill effect when things are targeting you. Another way to ignore cover is going to be the Psychic keyword. This was a little bit questionable before because we weren't 100% sure if Psychic would or would not affect cover, and they have doubled down on it in this Q&A. Psychic now definitely ignores the effect of cover and also ignores all modifiers to your wound roll. So you are ignoring ballistic skill modifiers, hit roll modifiers, and wound roll modifiers with the Psychic keyword. This is a massive massive buff for psychic weapons. Now, speaking of vehicles, they also discussed disembarking from transports. Transports now have the effect where if you destroy a transport and the unit is forced to make an emergency disembarkation, called a combat disembarkation, they're able to do so into melee. They specified that this does not count as a charge move and will be one of the 3 ways that you can now enter combat. This includes charging, making a surge move, which is a mechanic that's already existent in 10th edition, but has been clarified and made into a universal special rule. These are moves that you make in response to typically enemy shooting, as well as combat disembarkation. I believe the implication from the Q&A was that the only way to actually get charge bonuses were to make charge moves. Aircraft are seeing some absolutely massive changes. Essentially, the entire unit type is being reworked. Aircraft units now all start in reserve, like they do in 10th edition, and they arrive through ingress moves, this being the strategic reserve move that moves you onto the edge of the battlefield. They did specify in the Q&A that you do come in off the edge of the battlefield. However, instead of having a movement characteristic and operating like a normal unit as the game progresses, you now automatically up-down yourself. You automatically return into reserve at the end of your opponent's fight phase. They basically broke this down as being similar to setting an aircraft on a strafing run. You'll set them in on a flank to get a line of sight or a shot or a bombing run onto a particular target. Then you'll resolve all those attacks. Your opponent will get a turn to shoot back at the aircraft, and then the implication is that the aircraft is essentially going to do a big loop-de-loop, do another strafing run, and you're going to choose a new vector for it to come in off the table edge. They don't move like normal units. You don't get to movement block them and force them into reserve or anything like that. They're just going to automatically up-down themselves. This is a much cleaner mechanic than we've seen for aircraft in the past, and I kind of like it. We've talked a lot about how aircraft operating more like tokens is, I think, more interesting. It definitely, I think, showcases the utility of aircraft on a real battlefield a little bit more, since they don't typically interact very much with units on the ground beyond being able to shoot them and then sometimes being shot down by anti-aircraft fire. And that's essentially what they're trying to do here. Now, this does mean that we are going to have to see some very big changes to some types of aircraft. Bombers explicitly have effects that trigger when they move across units. In the current incarnation of the rules, these will all need to be reworked, since if the aircraft is just teleporting itself around the table, essentially, instead of moving around the table, you're not going to be able to use those effects. Now, talking specifically about some weapon keywords, they did specify that the Lance keyword remains +1 to wound on the charge. There was an article on Warhammer Community that specified that it was reroll wounds. That is incorrect. There have been a lot of typos in these Warhammer Community articles, unfortunately, and so we're sort of unable to trust them, but at least it's good to get that clarification. Hazardous is a little different. Currently, Hazardous fails on the roll of a 1. You take a test after attacks are made with that weapon and automatically inflicts 3 mortal wounds to the unit for each 1 that you roll. They have made Hazardous deal less damage, but be more impactful. They've turned it to failing on a roll of a 1 or 2, but inflicting 1 mortal wound for each failure. This essentially makes Hazardous do overall less damage to your army. The average damage per Hazardous check is 0.5 in the current incarnation. 1/6 of the time you're going to take 3 mortal wounds, so 0.5 per roll on average, essentially. This new version only deals 1 damage. However, it works on the roll of a 1 or a 2, so it's a 33% chance you're going to take that. So it's on average a third of a wound, essentially, per Hazardous check. I really like this change. It means that Hazardous has a more consistent effect. It's not quite as impactful in like big gluts where you're like, ooh, I failed, 2 or 3 Hazardous checks on an important tank and now it's halfway dead because I got a little unlucky. However, firing Hazardous weapons means that infantry units especially are going to be losing units with Hazardous weapons more often. However, large vehicles and things like that are going to be degraded more consistently from Hazardous, but aren't going to be basically killed as much. Indirect fire has gotten some massive changes. It still can target units that are not visible to the firing unit. This includes hidden units who are only visible to enemies within their detection range, typically 15 inches. So indirect fire can target units that are hidden. This also is important to note with Lone Operative, which we've already seen previewed, which explicitly prevents you from being targeted by indirect fire unless you are within that 12-inch visibility range. The Lone Operative mechanic does not use the detection range mechanic that Hidden does. It simply simply makes you invisible and untargetable from indirect fire if you're outside 12 inches. However, if indirect fire weapons cannot see their target, and this might be because of true line of sight, because of ruin blocking or terrain feature blocking line of sight, where units can be obscured by not being within obscuring terrain features, or by an indirect fire weapon targeting a hidden unit that is outside their detection range, you only hit on 6s, unless another friendly unit from your army can spot for you and can see the target. Now, this does require that if you are targeting a hidden unit, that unit that's spotting for you is within the detection range of that hidden unit. So you require forward operators and things like that to be able to guide in your artillery for it to be consistent. Now, what I don't know necessarily is if any of the restrictions that artillery has currently remain in 11th edition, that being the -1 to hit if you're firing indirectly, and the fact that all hit rolls of an unmodified 1, 2, or 3 automatically miss for artillery fire, but we'll just have to see. I almost wonder if they use the snap shooting mechanic that we see from Overwatch, for example, where indirect fire would, only hit on 6s and not be able to be rerolled potentially if you are firing at a unit that you can't see and is not spotted for you. These are big changes to artillery. They have mentioned that they wanted the artillery and indirect fire unit archetype to be a little bit less powerful in 11th edition, which is interesting because in 10th edition it already wasn't that powerful to begin with. But I do like the implication that artillery can be more effective if you do use it in conjunction with spotting units in the front of your army. Now, last but certainly not least for this discussion of core rules, let's talk about healing. This was already an implication that we saw previously, but healing now natively works like Necron reanimation protocols for all factions. That means that when you heal a wound that is in excess of your remaining wounds on any models in the unit, you can return models to that unit. So instead of having to reiterate how returning models to a unit works for every single instance of that mechanic, so if, for example, we have reanimation protocols and we have, endless swarm for Tyranids and we have the skin shift for chaos, those will all now work the same. Basically, if you heal damage and you have models that are destroyed from the unit and you heal in excess of your existing models, you will return models back to the unit. Now moving on, let's talk about some core detachment rules. The first one being that if you do not spend all of your detachment points, you do not get any special benefits. So when you're playing an incursion game, for example, you get 2 detachment points. When you're playing Strike Force, the standard game size, you will get 3 detachment points. You are encouraged to spend all of those detachment points. In addition to that, this was a question that I've gotten a lot, and apparently they got quite a bit as well, which is that whether or not detachments are cumulative with one another. I think a lot of people get confused by the nomenclature of detachments because you typically tend to think about it as a portion of your army getting that benefit, but that's not how they work in 11th edition. Your detachment ability, as you can think about it in 10th edition, is essentially going to be the collection of all of the detachments that you have chosen to play. So when you choose to play, let's say you play 3 detachments, 1 detachment point detachments, every model in your army is going to be affected by all of those detachment abilities. If you choose 3 detachments that have abilities that affect your whole army, every single model in your army is going to get access to those. In most cases, your 1-point detachments will only affect certain unit keywords, so you have to make sure that you know which unit keywords your detachment abilities are affecting, but that is how it's going to work. In addition to that, all of these stratagems and additional effects you are getting from your detachments are going to be cumulative. They discussed that most detachment builds will have an average of between 6 and 9 stratagems. This speaks to me that most of the 1-point detachments will probably have between 2 and 3 stratagems, I would imagine, and you may be able to get a few more if you have like 2 detachment point detachments that have 5 or 6 stratagems plus a 1 detachment point detachment that has somewhere around 2 stratagems, giving you a total of 8. So your detachments are going to be a little bit more complicated than they were in 10th edition, but they're also going to be that much more powerful. They also specified as well that detachments that have multiple abilities that affect a single unit keyword, and we've seen already some examples of this in, for example, Space Marines, which have tons of effects that can be stacked on things like speeders. All of those are going to be cumulative. So speeders are going to get, if you're taking, for example, like a Raven Wing style detachment in addition to a speeder benefiting detachment from the core Space Marine Codex, all of those are going to amalgamate together and they're all going to affect all your speeder units. So you're going to be able to stack a bunch of different abilities onto a single model, and those will all work simultaneously. In addition to that, they did specify that if you use allies, which we'll talk about momentarily, you only still get to choose detachments from your primary faction. So being able to take Chaos Demons, for example, doesn't give you access to Chaos Demon detachments. It only gives you access to Chaos Demon datasheets. And those will typically not have compatible faction or unit keywords with your existing detachments in most cases. Now let's move on to some general balance changes. The first one is huge. War gear points are returning to Warhammer 40k. In previous editions of the game, you had to pay points for every single optional piece of war gear that you included on a unit. So for example, if I had a pintle-mounted Stormbolter and a Hunter-Killer Missile and a Multi-Melta on my Land Raider, all of those choices would cost additional points, usually somewhere between 1 and 10 points, I think, for some of those heavier weapons. Now, in 10th edition, this changed so that you simply got all of those options for free, and that is being slightly reverted in 11th edition. First of all, they mentioned that a lot of the optional sort of secondary weapon systems are going to be free, so you don't have to track points for things like additional pistols, pintle-mounted, anti-infantry defensive weapons, and things like that. However, they mentioned that if you have big and impactful war gear selections, they mentioned specifically things like main weapon systems on vehicles, so turret-mounted weapons. The example given explicitly was Riptide battlesuits. Those would, with their burst cannon versus their ion accelerator, those would have different points values. So while we're not going to see the return to the granularity of previous editions, we will see a little bit of an adjustment with these datasheets that have one universally played weapon loadout. Those are going to probably be upcharged a little bit. In addition to that, in order to be consistent with this, we are going to see a big rebalance of points changes at the start of the edition. This always happens at the start of editions. I just released a video earlier today where I discussed that is probably going to be coming down the pipeline, and a lot of times what they'll do is that not only will they change points values of things that are impacted in different ways by the new mechanics, but they will also do a little bit of a balance pass, and they'll basically depower things that were very widely played in the previous edition while empowering things that were rarely played. It's most likely going to be more impactful than a standard data slate that we currently see. In addition, they have confirmed that current datasheets and rules will remain largely the same. They will just be reworked in the cases where they need to have rules changes in order to work with the new edition's mechanics. When Codex is released, these will be meaningful mechanical changes to how abilities or units work. We have seen already that there have been some datasheets that have shown off effects like combi weapons, where combi weapons are not necessarily a single independent unified weapon profile. Instead, different types of combi attack could get different keywords. The examples given were that combi rockets or combi meltas could be anti-vehicle devastating attacks. We see right now that all combi is anti-infantry devastating. However, they could get a little bit more granularity there. Plasma combi could get anti-infantry devastating like we have currently, which is cool. I like that. They did talk about some of the points changes we should be expecting, those being that fast-moving infantry, and especially fast-moving heavy infantry, they specified things like Chaos Possessed and Chosen, for example, would likely be going up. Indirect fire and artillery, to remain consistent with the auto 6s to hit, or the snap shooting sort of mechanic that they've talked about previously, will likely be seeing a decrease in points values, and a lot of things will be reworked based on how effective they are with the new rule set. They specify that allies were going to remain basically exactly the same and unchanged as they are in 10th edition, which in my opinion is a little bit sad. I think there was some interesting nuance that they could introduce with some detachments being ally specific and you having to pay detachment points, but maybe getting some additional mechanics for your allied units if you wanted to include allies. For example, if I wanted to take Imperial agents in an army, I could have a specific Imperial agent detachment that would cost me 1 detachment point, but I get access to assassins and things like that. I think there was some interesting design space there, but it looks like that's not the direction that they're going. Allied mechanics are going to be basically unchanged from 10th edition. That being that typically you will have a certain points allotment and number of units that you can take from specific allied codexes. You're going to be able to include those in your army, but don't get access to any of their detachments or anything like that. Now, moving on from that, let's talk about some very specific faction changes. The first one are Deathwatch. They did specify that Deathwatch are remaining part of the game, and the way that they were discussing it was a little bit hard to parse, but essentially, they said that Deathwatch are remaining in the game as a Space Marine chapter. They will still have access to the Codex Space Marine detachments and access to Imperial agents. They specified that they are not getting any new Deathwatch detachments. However, that does open the door for them to retain digital release detachments that we already have, like Black Spear Task Force, for example. Whether or not that's the case, I'm not 100% sure. As we are seeing, a lot of the digital release detachments are remaining in the game. In some cases, they are being rewritten to function differently within the new detachment infrastructure, but a lot of them are sticking around. And it sounds to me like that's going to be the case for Deathwatch, but they didn't explicitly say that. So it could be that they remain as an index that just uses Codex Space Marine detachments with things like kill teams, for example, but I don't know that for sure. What we do know, however, is that they are going to remain as a sub-faction in the new edition. In addition to that, the Demon Index is remaining. That was a big question mark that we had, whether or not, because basically all Demon detachments were digital release detachments, whether or not those were going to be surviving. They did say that because Demons, essentially, their Codex is an online release, that is going to be remaining effectively unchanged with the addition of the new 1-point detachments that we see being released for them that we already saw previewed. That means that a lot of their god-specific detachments and things like that are going to be remaining, which, given the power, or the evident power of psychic weapons in the new edition, means that demons look really strong, so we'll see how things go. They talked a little bit about orcs. Orc boys are still going to be able to get access to their special weapons that they have in the current edition of Codex Orcs. Those include things like rockets and big shootas. They're not within the Armageddon box set as options, but those will be remaining as options on their datasheet. They said something similar about Gretchen. I guess the Gretchen inside the Armageddon launch box do not have a runt herd with them, and what they specified is that runt herds are now going to be a 0-1 sort of attachment option. They're not characters or anything, but it's a unit champion inclusion in the Grot unit. Whether or not that makes Grots potentially cheaper if you do not take runt herds remains to be seen, so we'll see how it goes. They specified that Heresy-era Knight chassis, such as the Cerastus line of chassis, are still going to be available to Imperial Knights, which is great. They did talk about Imperial Agents for a little bit. Unfortunately, they specified that while Imperial Agents will still be available, they will be available as allies for other factions, and they will be available for play as their own faction. They are not receiving any new detachments at the launch of the edition, which makes me sad. Would like to see them support Imperial Agents a little bit more. Well, I think it's a tough line to tread making Imperial Agents competitive with other factions, since it is a faction that is designed to be taken inside or alongside other factions. I do think that it's more interesting if the faction is approached with the eye towards making them at least to some extent competitive alongside those other ones. Now, one thing they could do, obviously I'm just prognosticating here, this was not discussed inside the video, is they could make a lot of the Imperial Agents detachments much cheaper than other detachments. We see things like Veiled Blade Elimination Force, for example, that's just like a laughable joke of a detachment in comparison to other detachments within the game. And that, could very easily become a 1-point detachment that you can take alongside 2 other Imperial Agent detachments. And that maybe would make Imperial Agents feel a little bit better about what they got going on. They did drop a little bit here that a Dark Angels detachment is going to be returning. This was not one that they discussed as part of the Dark Angels faction focus, but they talked about the Lion's Blade Task Force, which is a Raven Wing focused detachment that currently exists in the Dark Angels faction pack. That is going to be available for Dark Angels as a 2 detachment point detachment. In addition to that, for Tyranids, they specified explicitly that Subterranean Assault would remain as a detachment and be synergistic with the Red Terror. Whether or not that means that Subterranean Assault remains as it is in the current incarnation of the rules, I have no idea. We'll have to see whether or not it's rewritten or it remains, sort of as powerful as it is now, but they did say that that is going to be the case. Now, last and, I don't know, maybe least here, we have a couple of sort of logistical things to talk about. This is in no particular order, but in terms of support and the contents of the new release sets, they discussed that the unpainted terrain they already have available is going to be made available to people alongside the pre-painted terrain that they previewed earlier this week. They specified that all of the launch box contents, that includes models as well as things like the chapter approved deck, are going to be available separately, with the exception of a lore book, I guess, that's available in there. I guess the models in the launch box will be upgraded to multi-part kits when they are released separately. They specify that the Legends support isn't going to be changing. However, Legends are going to be added to the Warhammer 40k app, which is cool to see, I guess, so it's going to be easier to use. A big change here is that in 11th edition, Crusade rules are no longer going to be part of codexes. They're going to be released separately in narrative packs, which opens the question to me, you know, who's still buying codexes at this point if they don't include up-to-date rules and they also don't include up-to-date Crusade rules? What is the point of these books? Jesus. They talked about that the launch box is going to include forces of around 750 points. It's going to be a little bit more than the Leviathan launch box we got in 10th edition, but a little bit less than the Saturnine box that we had in Horus Heresy. It will be a one-time release. Once it's sold out, it will not be restocked, which is a little bit scary for those who are fighting the good fight against scalpers everywhere on the internet. We'll see if they have any ways to get around pre-purchasing for people who are going to be reselling. Hopefully they do like a limited sort of staggered release where people will have options to pre-order it multiple times, and we'll have a limit imposed on the number that you can buy at a time, but we'll just have to see. And they also specified that the core rules will be available online for free, as has been the case in 10th edition, which is a nice change. It's good to be able to have access to the PDF. However, codex rules will still be required to be purchased with their books. So there you go. And with that, those are all of the pieces of information that we got through this Q&A. I think there's a little bit of, there's some stuff in there that they mentioned that weren't explicitly part of their question and answer that I was able to sort of tease out of the subtext of what they were talking about. So lots of interesting information for 11th edition. I'm excited to see it. Thanks to everyone for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks to everybody who supports me, whether that's over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.